that my question that would guide my own research would be whether or not Mimosa pudica plants remember to conserve energy of movement after repeated exposure to short periods of dark. Meaning that potentially, could these plants learn not to close their leaves after being repeatedly given short periods of dark in order to save the energy that it took to close the leaves? Could they learn that it wasn't dangerous? And with all that I'd read about, I hypothesized that yes, if exposure to dark periods was related to conservation of movement in the Mimosa pudica species, then these plants will remember to conserve energy of movement after repeated exposure to short periods of the dark. To test this, I plan to expose Mimosa pudica plant samples to a period of 15 minutes of darkness each day to observe if leaves continue to close in darkness after repeated exposure, if they could learn to expect it. I sourced my Mimosa pudica seedlings from an online nursery and prepared to turn my older brother's music room into a greenhouse. I labeled 9 plants for the experimental group and reserved 3 for the control group, which lived in a separate room and grew under a grow light to mimic the light exposure conditions, but without the dark exposure. Each day, at 4:45 in the afternoon until 5 p.m., I put tarps over all of the windows to simulate the dark conditions for the plants. After the 15-minute dark period, I recorded how many leaves closed on the plant. And after another 15 minutes, 30 minutes since the start of the experiment, I recorded again how many leaves were closed. And I continued this for 27 days. And the results were not exactly what I expected. The first graph shows the leaf closure recorded after 15 minutes for each of the 9 experimental plants. When I averaged the data and calculated standard deviation, I created a new chart that showed this condensed data and found that, on average, the plants started with a higher leaf closure, slowly decreased, and then hopped back up again at the end of the experiment. When we look at the data post 30 minutes, it's relatively the same trend. So the question still exists. Did the plants remember to close their leaves? Yes and no. Yes, the trend shows a small best fit line with a downward slope. And for a while, the plants did start to close their leaves less. No, because this data is not entirely reflective of statistical significance. The error lines calculated from the standard deviation show overlap, and that it's likely that changes in the data are most likely due to chance. However, this might be for multiple reasons. Well, yes, it could be that the plants didn't really remember. The experimental design was not without fault. Light leakage from the tarping on different days could have skewed the data. Additionally, we see that the chart on certain days spikes higher with leaf closure. And in my notes for my observations, I also recorded that it was on these exact same days that it was also very cloudy, which meant that the leaves were not fully extended from when the experiment began, because it was already dim light conditions from the natural window light. The leaves were already partially open, meaning that it was easier and more likely for them to close, or that they expected night to be sooner, not the simulated dark period. If this experiment were repeated, a larger sample size of plants, a simulated light source that didn't change brightness, and a more environmentally controlled experiment space could produce different results. And the fact that the plants did eventually tend to close their leaves less during the middle period suggests that this could have significant results. If this experiment were to be replicated, then I would expect the results to demonstrate a statistically significant trend towards the leaves closing less and less.